The Book of Revelation. You know the one. For centuries, it's been this source of endless fascination, and let's be honest, a lot of confusion. All those visions of beasts and angels and the end of the world have really captured people's imaginations. But there's one part, the letters to the seven churches, that most people think is pretty cut and dried, just straightforward history.
But what if, and this is a big what if, that's not the whole story? What if those very letters, written to real historical churches, actually contain a hidden code? A code that points not forward to the future, but backward to the single most important week in the entire Christian story. Okay, let's really get into this. So the common interpretation, the one you've probably heard, is pretty clear. You've got the Apostle John, and he's told to write letters to 7 real churches in what's now Turkey, places like Ephesus, Laodicea, and these letters get right to the point, tackling their very real, on-the-ground moral and spiritual problems. And for most people, that's kind of where the story ends. Case closed. But the source material we're digging into today proposes a really radical twist. It makes the case that this historical reading, while true, is really just the first layer. It's what's on the surface. And that if you peel that layer back, you find something amazing, a carefully built allegory for the events of Passion Week. You know, the final dramatic days of Jesus' life leading up to Easter. So you've got these 2 layers working at the same time. On top, the surface reading, real letters to real churches. Simple enough. But underneath is the deeper meaning. And this is where it gets really mind-bending. The theory is that Jesus' message to these 7 New Testament churches is actually a metaphorical retelling of his big confrontation with the Old Testament church, that is, the nation of Israel, during his final week in Jerusalem. So you might be asking, how on earth do you even begin to unlock something like that? Well, the author of this theory says there's a key. It's a special way of reading called a hermeneutic of irony. Now, that sounds super academic, but the idea is actually simple. Don't just take what you're reading at face value. The surface of the text might be designed to intentionally point you to a different hidden reality, one you can find in the gospel stories about Easter. And the source we're looking at, well, it does not pull any punches. It calls this part of Revelation an artificially constructed literary composition, basically an illusion. Now, that doesn't mean it's fake or false. It means it's built like a magic trick. The language and the structure are designed to make you look one way, while the real meaning, the real action, is happening somewhere else entirely. So here's the core idea in a nutshell. When you're reading about Jesus addressing the church in, say, Ephesus, this theory suggests you should also be picturing Jesus confronting the religious leaders in the Jerusalem temple. The problems of the new church are a direct mirror of the problems of the old one. So does this wild idea actually hold up? Well, let's get into the evidence. All right, let's roll up our sleeves and get into the real nuts and bolts here. How could these 2 worlds, these 2 stories, possibly be connected? Well, according to this theory, it's all about finding the parallels, not just in the language, but in the very structure of the writing itself. Okay, first up, the structure. And this to me is just brilliant. It turns out every single one of these 7 letters follows the exact same rigid 6-part formula. The theory argues that this is no accident. This 6-part structure is like a blueprint that perfectly mirrors a walk through the 6 main sections of the Jerusalem temple, from the outermost court of the Gentiles all the way into the most sacred space, the Holy of Holies. It's as if Jesus is doing a systematic, room-by-room inspection of his spiritual house. The first code-cracking tool has a fancy name, synonymous parallelism. But the idea is simple. Think of it like rhyming ideas instead of rhyming words. The author uses different images or different phrasing to express the exact same core concept, creating this echo between the 2 texts. Here's a perfect example. On the surface, in the illusion of Revelation, the church at Ephesus gets praised for testing people who claimed to be apostles. Okay, now let's look at the reality in the Gospel of Matthew. What happens? The chief priests confront Jesus in the temple and test him by questioning his authority. See that? It's the same core action, testing someone's authority, playing out in 2 different scenes. It's a perfect parallel. Okay, so the next tool is basically the polar opposite of that. It's called antithetic parallelism. And here, the connection isn't made through similarity, but through direct opposition. The author deliberately sets up a theme in one text and contrasts it with its exact opposite in the other. And check out this example. It's a really powerful one. In Revelation, what's the ultimate reward for the faithful? Jesus promises them the morning star, a beautiful symbol of light and hope. So what's the parallel in Matthew's gospel? It's the ultimate punishment for the unfaithful guest, being thrown into outer darkness. You've got light and darkness. It's a perfect opposition. The idea is that this contrast is so stark it has to be intentional, forcing you to see these two stories as two sides of the very same coin. So look, this is a really clever literary puzzle, for sure. But so what? What's the point? Why does reading Revelation this way actually matter? Well, it's about seeing the bigger picture. It's about realizing there's a single, continuous story of God's interaction with his people being told here.
So let's just walk through the logic one more time. The hidden reality is Jesus' ministry during that final Passion Week, where he confronts the spiritual rot he finds in the temple and its leadership. The surface illusion, the allegory, is what we're reading in Revelation, where he confronts very, very similar kinds of decay in these new churches. It's the same fundamental pattern, just playing out on a new stage in a new era.
And to be super clear, this theory isn't saying the problems in those 7 churches weren't real. Of course they were. It's arguing their problems were so significant precisely because they were a direct echo, a repeat of the very decay that led to Israel's crisis. It serves as this incredibly powerful warning that the New Testament community isn't somehow immune to making the exact same mistakes as the Old.
Ultimately, this interpretation gives us a completely new lens to look through when we read a familiar part of the Bible. It transforms it from what we might have thought was just a historical report card into this complex, multi-layered literary work that is just packed with hidden meanings and theological depth.
And all of that leaves us with one final, pretty provocative thought. If a text as famous, as well-known as the Book of Revelation can contain such a deeply embedded, intricate code right under our noses, well, it just makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other hidden structures, what other secret meanings might be waiting to be discovered in other ancient writings we thought we knew inside and out?